1. All right, we're live, and I need to know if you guys can hear me okay. And then we're going to test my audio, make sure we're good, and then we're going to test Father Deacon Dr. Ananias's audio, make sure he's good before we start yapping. So, welcome to Jay's Analysis. We got a treat. We got an academic treat for you tonight because, of course, all that matters is academic theology. Nothing else matters. Just your IQ. That's how you get into heaven, is whoever has the best IQ. Psych.
Yeah, you didn't know that.
Yeah, psych. Babyface. I bought a good lamp finally so I don't look like a washed out old hag. We are good, so you guys can hear me. Is the audio good on my end? Okay, now cross your fingers. Let's hear Father Deacon Dr. Ananias. Welcome, and let's make sure that he's not echoey. Can you hear us?
Am I echoey? Can you hear me?
Can you guys hear him without an echo before we start yapping? Cross your fingers. Yes. Okay, so they can hear me. Gotta wait for the chat to catch up. Can you hear him? Father Deacon, tell us a little bit about your what's one of your favorite films? Do you have a favorite film?
Oh man, that's a hard. You know what? Some films that I really like is Terrence Malick's films.
I like Terrence Malick.
Mm-hmm. What was I thought Tree of Life was good.
I need to revisit Tree of Life. I did see it when it came out. The audio is bad. Okay, so he's a little quiet. Let's get him louder. Can you talk for me, Father Deacon?
Okay, how about that? Better, louder.
How is he now? Can you guys hear him? I'm gonna try to mute when Can you guys hear him?
Up, down, echo.
I need you to talk so I can see how the audio is with you.
Yeah. All right, check. Mic 1, 2, 3. So yeah, Terrence Malick. I also like Badlands from Terrence Malick. Of course, I love all the 80s. Something about Christmas too in the 80s movies. So my wife and I had to pop on a bunch of 80s movies. Gremlins is a great 80s movie that I recommend for everybody. So I'm trying to pop up the chat so I can see.
Yeah, I think we're okay. I think the thing is that you're on a laptop, so you're using an internal microphone in the laptop, right?
No, I'm using my external mic.
Oh, you do have okay. Is there any way to turn it up just a little bit?
Up preamp. So, what's that?
Is there any way to turn it up just a little bit, and then I think we're good to go?
Yeah. Okay, how's that?
Your input audio up a little bit more, if you can.
Okay, let's see. How about that? Better? Is it louder?
It's good enough. Louder. Yeah, just try to talk as loud as you can because you're coming in low. But I think we're good. All right, we got a full house tonight. Welcome all you nerds. We're going to be getting into some deep stuff. Thank you for those movie recommendations. I do need to revisit Terrence Malick, but we're going to talk about Scotus and Anselm, and I want to thank Father Deacon Dr. Ananias for joining me. I'm going to try to make it as loud as possible. I don't know why every time there's a audio issue, it never fails. There's a problem. I've got him up all the way, so
I'm just going to talk really loud.
There you go. Just scream into the microphone. So that's
Let me repeat myself.
All right. Everybody says it's better now. So, but you don't have to scream.
That's a good screaming.
Okay, so now that I have my library back, I did finally dig out my John Donne Scotus, and I have an essay that I wrote back in grad school about the ontological argument. And Father Deacon Dr. Ananias also has some interest in Anselm, and so it relates to a lot of the apologetics that we've discussed. It relates to a lot of the philosophy that we've discussed. Transcendental arguments come into play. Uniates Eastern Catholics. We're going to talk about that because that's a big puzzle piece when it comes to the issue of how to understand Latin theology and medieval Latin theology, because there is a difference between the schools, the Franciscans and John Duns Scotus, from the Thomists, right? So a lot of the Roman Catholics have been critical and said that you have not been fair because you act like Thomism is dogma and you don't give a fair place to the nuances of Bonaventure and John Duns Scotus and the Franciscans. Well, I am aware of that, actually. I did have a period when, before I became serious about orthodoxy and looking at orthodoxy, I thought, well, maybe I can, make this cope with Eastern Catholicism. Maybe Uniatism is the answer. And of course, David did a great video on just the sort of prima facie problems with Eastern Catholicism and how there's a lot of contradictions there, which I'll recommend and link later. But Father Deacon, thank you. You want to tell us a little bit before we get into the meat of all this about your experience with Anselm and your interest in Anselm?
Yeah, so if some of your viewers remember, I went to undergrad at the Great Books Roman Catholic College, Thomas Aquinas College, Classical Liberal Arts. In senior year, you have to write and defend a thesis. And I believe it was sophomore theology was when I read Anselm's Proslogion, and I actually liked the apophatic theology. Appealed to me. For the Latins, the via negativa, and so I decided to actually write my dissertation, my senior dissertation, on Anselm's argument. Now, keep in mind that wasn't a very popular thesis at that college because of their commitment to Aquinas and Aquinas's critique of what was perceived to be, I think it was actually, he was responding to Bonaventure, a similar argument that Bonaventure had made. Whether God's existence is self-evident. So I believe that's Summa Theologica question 2, article 2. Correct me if I'm wrong on the... So anyways, that's when, I wrote my dissertation on Anselm. And at the time I was defending that, the other thing is that for Thomas, all knowledge about God from a natural theology perspective is derived a posteriori from sense experience. So all arguments, philosophical arguments about God, or anything for that matter, have to be grounded in sense experience. And so that was another part of the critique too, that the Thomists had of Aquinas's argument of Anselm's argument, is that it was a type of a priorism that would in the end fail if, obviously what Aquinas was saying, that philosophical thought must be grounded within sense experience. So I kind of argued a couple different things, that the argument was not actually ontological, and we can talk about that, who came up with the term ontological, how does that apply? And then also, was it possible to conceive of the argument is actually being grounded a posteriori? So that's kind of what I had written on for my senior thesis.
Yeah, my early 20s, I was, as you probably know, very into Van Til and Bahnsen. So I had a unique approach to the ontological argument where there were people actually who were students of Bahnsen who had a bit of an appreciation with the a priori approach of Anselm. But of course, we know that ultimately Anselm's ontological argument doesn't actually work. It actually fails in many ways. However, there are some insights. It is an interesting reversal of the classical foundationalist approach of most of the other types of argumentation. So when we talk about John Duns Scotus, we want to be fair to him and give him some credit for being willing to critique specific areas of Thomism. So in that regard, I will touch on that because I do have this week I did brush up on my Scotus, so I've got multiple of his works here in this volume, and I also read in the Cambridge companion to John Duns Scotus to make sure that my analysis was correct, and I think it was, because so I didn't get anything wrong. But another point I wanted to make about Anselm too is that a lot of people are unaware of the fact that Anselm's theology isn't just important in terms of the ontological argument, but he's also important for the atonement theory that he put forward. Yeah. And I've read most of Anselm's works, and so if we look at his atonement theory, and if we look at Cor Deus Homo, we actually find some Christological errors. Now, when I was a Roman Catholic, when I was a trad, I was really into Aquinas, and I was into Anselm. I had an appreciation for him, and I did read Bonaventure and Scotus and these guys too. But I had no conception of the possibility that there could be a serious Christological error in Anselm. And so I was skeptical when I heard this, but it wasn't until I delved really deeply into St. Maximus himself. And if you've read the excellent book, Free Choice in St. Maximus Confessor, which is a pretty well-known, rare book by Dr. Farrell, he has a chapter on the monothelite conclusions of a lot of the Augustinian approaches. And the later Augustine, I'm not saying that Augustine was intentionally a monothelite, but the later theology that developed in the West unintentionally became monothelite. And so one place that we can see that is actually in Cor Deus Homo 9. And if you read Cor Deus Homo 1, chapter 1, section 9, you'll find that Anselm actually says, Christ therefore came not to do his own will, but that of the Father. For his holy will was not derived from his humanity, but from the divinity. So there's an attempt to sort of override the will of Christ, the natural human will that he possesses. And this is a result of the Augustinian conceptions of the will being led by whatever it is more inflamed by, you could say, right? So that if the will loves God, it's going to be more inclined to the divine, or if it loves creatures, it's going to be more inclined to the human. Now, again, Augustine precedes the debates about monoenergism and monothelitism. So I'm not accusing Augustine of being a monothelite, but there is in the soteriology of Augustine, because of the dominance of the predestinarian idea, you have the necessary conclusion that within Christ there has to therefore be also a preeminence of the divine will over the human will. So the human will kind of is supplanted in its natural created energy and properties, you see. And so, again, I'm very aware of all the nuances of this. I'm not saying that he was a Calvinist, but there's the tendency there because of the doctrine of efficacious grace, of unconditional election in Augustine, where you do have this tendency. And by the way, Aquinas does teach efficacious grace as well. So many medieval theologians did follow in the train of Augustine in his theology of grace. Anselm does also. And so that's why you'll find in that same section, in Cor Deus Homo, he also talks about Christ's, and this is a critique that we often make of the Christology of the Latin Church, which is that although, again, it may not intend to view the incarnation or the divine hypostasis as a result of the incarnation, oftentimes it inadvertently does. Christ's hypostasis was divine from all eternity. It's not the result, right? Who he is as a divine person is not the result of the incarnation. He assumed impersonal human nature, and his human nature has for its personhood the divine person of the Logos. But if you read Cor Deus Homo 1:9, he actually refers to Christ as a human person. Christ is not, strictly speaking, a human person, right? So, and we've covered this many times. You can read the Bathrellos book on the Byzantine Christ, and how there is symmetrical and asymmetrical Christology. That's true. But technically speaking, in Maximus and all the Orthodox Fathers, the more proper way to conceive of this is to stress that the personhood of Christ is asymmetrical, meaning that his humanity is impersonal. The only person present there is the second person of the Godhead from all eternity in all of the incarnate actions of Christ. That's always stressed.
Jay, I have a question.
Yeah, I'm sorry. But I did want to stress this because I'm not trying to take over the whole chat, but just because it's very important to understand that we're talking about a confusion of Christology and of absolute divine simplicity and of natural theology. These are all going to come into play with Anselm.
Jay, do you think that this associating Christ with the human person could also result, perhaps even with Anselm, but obviously today, when people get these Christological eras going, that they're taking person in a vulgar sense. Vulgar, I mean, in the common kind of colloquial usage that, oh, you're a person, you're you know, they're kind of, it's bad theology. It's not being clear with the term. That there's a very technical term in theology when we're using this is for referring to Christ. And so
I think you're right. Yeah, when we touched on that before, you made this great point because you were talking about how we typically are just thinking in modern Western parlance, and so for a lot of people that maybe aren't into the deep philosophical terms, and hence why we did that stream where we covered a lot of these more difficult terms. We talked about how this is not common parlance, right? We're not making using these terms in the way that most people in the modern West understand. There's a different patristic way to understand these terms. So, for example, a lot of people misunderstand hypostasis just to be the existing individual, the concretized individual, and there's a sense in which that's partly true, but that's not all that there is in hypostasis, right? If it was all that there was, then we would be modalist because we would not understand that. In the triad itself, there's three distinct hypostases that are really different. They really are distinct personages, and they're just as distinct as they are one. So there's no imbalance between the unity and the multiplicity in the Godhead. They're just as three as they are one. They're just as one as they are three. And so one reason why we can't say that hypostasis is just a concretized individual would mean that the three hypostases are just masks for the divine nature, right? Sometimes people will conceive of this as all hypostasis is an instance of nature, but that's not true. It is an instance of nature, but it's also more than that, and so we see that from the triad. But again, we don't want to go too far back into all that we've already covered. Again, if people really want to get deep into that, just read The Byzantine Christ by Demetrios Bathrelos, and he covers how that debate fleshes out in the 4th, 5th, and 6th councils. But again, I just wanted to point out that the mistake in Anselm does relate to absolute divine simplicity. It does relate to the incarnation. It affects the incarnation. It relates to his view of natural theology, because he still does have a view of natural theology, as we'll see with John Duns Scotus, and it relates to Christology. And this is treated very well in the Free Choice and Maximus Confessor book. And again, I was for a long time very reticent to accept that, and then I read the appendix. Actually, there's a great appendix in this book that is a critique of the Christological conclusions of Augustine's predestinarianism. You see, because if Augustine's doctrine of predestination is correct, then it affects the incarnation to the extent that when Christ becomes incarnate, then his humanity also has to be predestined. So it causes a lot of these really difficult problems, because the divine will then trumps and supplants the human energy and will. And so what you get is a monothelitism and a monoenergism. And again, I'm not saying Augustine intended that, but what happens in the development of Latin theology is that it absolutely goes in that direction. And again, as a former Calvinist, I know all about this, because as Calvinists, we would appeal to Augustine to say, yes, there's only one energy in conversion. The divine will and energy has to take over you, and that's how you're kind of like, you're dead. Your will is dead, and you're moved into the state of being converted effectually. And so again, Aquinas also teaches the same doctrine of effectual, efficacious grace. The cause, when God moves in this way in grace, he actually does cause the human will to move in the direction that God intended to move. And so for us, that's a supplanting of the will and energy that's natural to humanity in terms of his free will, right? So there's created human will and energy that moves in its own sphere, you could say. And so when we participate in conversion, there's never a loss of synergy, right? So there's a divine will that is obviously more powerful. We're not saying they're equal. It's like, oh, you do half of the work, God does half the work, and it's this 50-50 thing. No, it's more of the union idea of Christology, where you have in Christ his human nature and energy is deified and raised by the divine will and energy. That's all taught very clearly in the Sixth Council and in Book 3 of St. John Damascus. So I'm sorry, I didn't want to get too deep into that. Forgive me, but I did want to stress.
No, Jay, point out too for the listeners that you can find all of this in Augustine's On Nature and Grace. So that's where he fleshes this out.
Yeah. That's a great point. Yeah, if you read the anti-Pelagian treatises, which I've read all those, he has a work on perseverance. He has on nature and grace, and then there's one more on baptism, I think, where he talks about against the Pelagians, where he discusses the topics of efficacious grace. He also, in many places in City of God, he also talks about the fixed number of the chosen elect. Now, again, we're not saying that there's not. I mean, I think God, in His foreknowledge, obviously He knew who would be chosen, and that we don't see these things in tension. In other words, like God's decision is not based on our decision, and our decision is not based on God's decision. There's some kind of compatibility that we don't understand as humans, and so all throughout Scripture, you will see this presented as a mystery. And so, in Latin theology, you've had the tendency to not accept the mystery of compatibilism and try to side on one of these things. Like, oh, well, the Arminians are right that like we make all the decisions and God kind of has to, in like open theology, has to wait to see what we do. Or you have the Calvinistic doctrine where it's the will of God is identical to the essence of God and everything's completely determined. And we're not, so again, and people in the chat, we're not semi-Pelagian. Actually, semi-Pelagianism is rejected in the canons of Carthage that are accepted at Nicaea II. But what I'm saying is that the solution to this issue is that grace is uncreated energy, and it always is in synergy with the natural human will and energy that we possess. And we know this from Christology. So for us, Christology is the ordo theologia that will determine our soteriology. And in Calvinism, because there's a different ordo theology, and in Roman Catholicism there's a different ordo theologia, they will start in a different way. So Calvinism will use soteriology to determine Christology, right? So they'll have their soteriological conclusions first, and then they'll work out whatever they think about Christology as an afterthought. Oh, well, then Jesus was damned by the Father to make the payment. And this is where we come back to Anselm, because the whole idea of paying off a giant infinite debt is from Anselm. Anselm is the one who formulates this idea that God had to pay God off. And we would say that's kooky and crazy. And actually it doesn't make any sense. But it's where a lot of the atheists will kind of come with this. You believe that God had to pay off God, dude. That don't even make no sense, man. And we would actually agree as Orthodox that we do not teach that infinite payment doctrine of Anselm. So it is relevant. All of the different arenas of theology come into play here. Forgive me, I've monopolized. You speak.
No, it's exactly what we've always said, that your starting points are going to determine your arguments. And so if you have this kind of starting point, the soteriology of Calvinistic perspective, obviously you're going to end. So it's not like they just happen to err and make a mistake. In some sense, they're being very consistent. It's coming from the starting points. And so, again, we can go back to critique the starting points that, look, this is wrong. I also like what you have to say about, again, you get this in the West, this kind of dialectic of an either or pitted against each other. So you'll see people say that, you already brought up what whether you're Pelagian or are you a determinist? You have these things again. So what you get is this kind of idea that God does all the work in salvation. Man does nothing. Or you're Pelagian. And Orthodoxy doesn't have that problem of that tension, that there's some sort of dance and in symphony and synergy between the two, but ultimately it's a mystery. And it seems that the Western mind always wants an algorithm formula. Well, then how much? Well, why do we have to tell you how much? Why is that the important part? is it 50-50? Is it 30-40? And so you get these two kind of extremes that orthodoxy just simply doesn't have to deal with. And therefore, because of those starting points as well, the very notion of faith and works means something completely different within orthodoxy as it does on Protestant.
Right. You have no notion of the super abundant, super added merits of the saints and this giant treasury of the merits of the saints that you can draw from, like some divine heavenly Vatican bank or some nonsense like this. It's just crazy. But that's all kind of flowing out of this idea of the giant infinite debt payment scheme. And so, by the way, it's no wonder that you would have a Vatican bank that's involved in giant global money laundering scandals if that's how they conceive of their church, as a big bank of spiritual merits that can be doled out. It's total nonsense. But that was in the news this week, was that multiple Vatican investments were shown to be related to international money laundering. No surprise there, and that goes all the way back to Roberto Calvi and the Vatican bank scandals. But by the way, we had some trolls in the chat. I showed, and if you read the book that I showed, there's multiple quotes in that book from the last video on Antichrist, where the church fathers do teach a future conversion of the Jews. It's in book 4 of St. John Damascus. It's in St. Athanasius. It's many places in St. Cyril of Alexandria. So that's actually, that guy's gone. All right, so let's talk about Scotus a little bit here. So I dug out my Scotus. I did not realize or recall, because it's been, like I said, it was about 10 years ago when I started looking at Orthodoxy, and I thought, well, maybe Uniates and Bonaventure, maybe they have a way out of this dilemma. And there is a treatise, actually there's a couple treatises in this book. There is the natural knowledge of God, there is the existence of God, and then there's a treatise called the unicity of God. So I did get a chance to review these treatises. The most relevant is the second and third, the existence of God and the unicity of God. The unicity of God is fairly short. It's about 15, 20 pages. The existence of God is a little bit longer. It's about 50 or 60. But what we see is Scotus essentially giving us a primer on his take on apologetics, his argumentation. I'll summarize what he says from the, let's see, this is a Scotus, James F. Ross and Todd Bates, who are Scotus scholars, because I don't profess to be a Scotus scholar. I've just read these 3 works that we mentioned here. But they state the natural theology of Scotus to be as follows. And from what I understood in the treatise, and yes, I did read it, it's not fake footnotes. He says, number 1, we can reason demonstrably to the necessary existence and the nature of God from what is in the world, but not from imagined situations or from conceivable to us situations, rather only from the possibility logically required for us to know what actually is so. So there is a kind of presupposition of generic metaphysics. This is going to be very crucial for Scotus, where we can start with generic metaphysical univocal assumptions. So this is one place where he disagrees off the bat with Aquinas, is that there are univocal conceptions that apply to God and man, particularly one area, and that is called being. But we'll get to that in a minute. Well, that's the next point, is that there is a univocal transcendental notion of being that is common to God and man, and God is part of this generic category of things that participate in being. So being is a property, a predicate, common to humans, things, and God, right off the bat. And this is in contrast to Dr. Goff and to Michael Lofton and all the uniate-minded guys, Eric Ibarra, whoever, who have tried to stress that it's the same theology, bro. The Scotus is saying the same thing that you Orthodox Palamites are saying with his, well, right off the bat, no. This is a violation of the apophatic theology that we hold to. We would not say that univocal being exists between God and man. The being that God has is an uncreated energy. It's not univocal to created beings. There's no, you can make analogies between the energies and created things, but not the essence of God. And the problem is that we will see pretty consistently through John Duns Scotus, that there is a strict doctrine of actus purus. There is a strict identification of many attributes with the essence of God. And we'll see that his formal distinction between the attributes actually is not the same thing as Palamos. It doesn't hold up. It's very much distinguished from a real distinction between the energies. He goes on to say...
Jay, also point out, too, that argument would apply to all you Goofus Orthodox Latinizers as well, that think that there's some type of compatibility there.
Great point. Exactly, because a lot of the ecumenist-minded Orthodox people believe that, oh, these are just saying the same thing, and we can just smush these two positions together. I'm going to show you that doesn't work. But let's get a few more statements about the summation of Scotus. There is an a priori demonstration of the existence of God that is, an a priori demonstration of God's existence is impossible. So he's not going to agree with Anselm's a priorism or ontologism. He's going to reject that, but there will be some interesting attempts to use Anselm in the work, The Existence of God. John Duns Scotus believes that there is not a possible a priori argument for God's existence because there is nothing explanatorily prior to divine being. Thus, all reasoning must be a posteriori from the real dependences among the things that we perceive to the possibility of the first being. So in other words, his philosophy starts with the Aristotelian argument of causality. We're going to see that. So he's very much an Aristotelian. He's not a Platonist. He's very much an Aristotelian who will go to great lengths in the argument for the existence of God to capitalize on the causal argument. In this way, he's actually very similar to Aquinas. He believes in a strict first cause Aristotelian. It's almost copy and paste from Aristotle, and it's almost the same as Aquinas's argument from a first cause, and he'll expend much energy in the book just trying to argue about how there's not an infinite regress of causes and there must be some unmoved first cause. And it'll just be things like, well, if the first cause wasn't perfect, then you could have multiple. In other words, let me rephrase that. There has to be one first cause because in some point in this chain of events, every lesser cause is imperfect. And so if there's an imperfect series of causes, there must be some perfect cause from which it comes. And that perfect cause can't be multiple because if it was multiple, then one of those multiple first causes would be lacking and imperfect, right? So where did it get its degree of perfection from? So in other words, there is a series of assumptions about perfection that is prior to his argumentation about causality, and we'll get to why that doesn't work. But as with the ontological argument, it also has the presupposition of existence and perfection being predicates that actually exist in the world, but that hasn't been demonstrated yet. That's why the ontological argument will fail. Among other reasons, it's also based on absolute divine simplicity. But before we get to that, there cannot be a necessary... Such a being, the first principle, cannot be possible without existing necessarily. The first being, God, is therefore simple, omni-intelligent, free and spontaneous, omnipotent, and positively infinite. There is therefore a formal distinction between his attributes that are not just conceptual, but also a distinction amongst the attributes. Now that may sound, that's the point, of course, where the Uniates all say that, well, this is where we can find common cause, because he says that the distinctions are not notional and conceptual like Aquinas, they are formal. But let's get a little bit clearer here, because they note that there is a universal, all-encompassing, univocal conception of being, without which we can't begin to think. Scotus considers such a conception a necessity, and this necessity is what we use to demonstrate God's existence. And indeed, it is the basis for a coherent science of metaphysics. So this is a scientific, reasoned, rational approach to the existence of God. What's it based on? Not transcendental arguments. Don't mistake the fact that the word transcendental is used here. It's not a transcendental argument. It's the assumption of being. Generic being is the most primary, properly basic thing in his system. So some philosophies might look at causation or causality as properly basic. Scotus is unique here, and this is what he would share with Anselm, is that he does agree that the most properly basic starting point for all philosophy is being, metaphysics. But I'm sorry, I'm going to let you speak here, take the floor, but my initial critique of this is that on what basis do we know that being is the most properly basic, clear, self-evident, non-theory laden principle in the universe?
Oh, because it's self-evident, don't you know?
So it's self-evident that it's self-evident. This is why. That's right. And in fact, I had it when I first came into the Roman Catholic Church and I was starting to read Aristotle back in 2003 and 4. I had a long discussion with a pretty philosophically astute Roman Catholic priest. I brought this story up many times. And he did his PhD on Anselm and the ontological argument. And he said that, as I was researching this argument, trying to see if it fit together, if it was valid, he said, I came to the conclusion that it's valid if you believe that being is the most basic fundamental category of reality. And get this, I kid you not. He said, it works if you believe that being bees. So he's admitting that the system is ultimately self-referential at its most basic starting point. And what's the most basic starting point? Being, generic being. And being is self-existent, and therefore being bees. If you admit that being bees, circular, then you can build this system of the ontological argument, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is the whole critique of classical foundationalism or natural theology, is that they start from these, what they call self-evident axioms or propositions. But isn't it funny that Aquinas actually has an argument? Is God's existence self-evident? And he basically goes, well, it might be what one person conceives of as God might be different than another. Well, then why wouldn't that apply also to what one person conceives as self-evident
or being?
Might be for, I mean, it's just assumed that we just all universally perceive and understand self-evident propositions and positions in the same way. Why do I have to be forced to say something? And clearly, all the evidence suggests that we don't see self-evident, what they would call self-evident propositions as the same. By the way, I think that might even come from Aristotle. That the first thing in your order of knowledge is being, that it is, quid est. That, and as you pointed out, the Scotus is going to be pulling a lot from Aquinas. Aristotle. Did I say Aquinas? Aristotle. Yep. That this principle is in Aristotle.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, it's almost more slavish to Aristotle than perhaps even Aquinas. I mean, you could argue that. I mean, it's hard to. I mean, you could debate that if you want to, but where's my Scotus? Let's get it out here. Okay, so in the Existence of God treatise, what he does is he lays out these arguments for whether in the realm of being something exists that is actually infinite. So he begins with these arguments on the basis of pretty heavy philosophically heavy-handed ideas about infinity, perfection, existence, esse, right? All these things that in his mind are just kind of understood, because we have to understand that for the ancient and medieval world, there kind of was a universal attitude of how to approach philosophy and metaphysics. I mean, I think that Eastern Fathers were more inclined to critiquing presuppositions, and we've discussed that many times in different books and different works, different church fathers. And that's why you get a transcendental argument in John Damascus. But when it comes to these Latin fathers, you get the assumption that we can just kind of approach all these categories as if they are self-evident and they're not theory-laden. They didn't think about things, especially in the West, as theory-laden. Nobody had this conception. This is a later philosophical issue that, I mean, it was already kind of incipiently there, but not explicitly there. So he says that God is a this, and because this has a single nature, we can start with reasoning from natural theology. So here's the second point, which clearly distinguishes Scotus from our view, is that Scotus believes in natural theology. There's an entire essay in here about Scotus's natural theology. There's an entire work at the beginning about the natural knowledge that we have of God. And it is not, I mean, it does differ in areas from Aquinas, but again, Scotus is not teaching an orthodox view of anthropology, of Christology, of uncreated grace, and the way that we conceive of and know God directly that you would see, for example, in Father Staniele. If you look at Volume 1 of Father Staniele, you'll see that he clearly rejects natural theology and he believes in natural revelation. If you read the famous essay, as we mentioned the last time, from St. Justin Popovich on St. Isaac the Syrian's theory of knowledge, you'll see that it's a rejection of natural theology. The whole essay is against natural theology. So our saints, I think Father Staniele will probably end up a saint, 20th century theologians, saints, they're very clear about the rejection of natural theology, and that's why we're not Thomists, you see. And there are Orthodox people who think, well, yeah, we should do we should do natural theology because we have the same patristic heritage. No, it's not. That doesn't work like that, right? So again, the second point is that as he begins to make his argumentation, Scotus argues from basic generic theism. So generic theism, reasoning up from creatures to the first cause, which he shares in common with Aquinas, which he directly lifts the causal chain from Aristotle. That's completely not orthodox. So right away, there's no generic conception of being. For us, the being of God is an uncreated energy. God's unicity, God's knowledge, God's energy, God's existence, those are energies.
Yes.
They're not the essence of God. And so therefore, there's no way we could ever accept that being is univocal. And that doesn't mean that we're agreeing with Aquinas either. We're simply pointing out that what he's having to do to make this connector between the realm of creatures and the divine is because he doesn't have a doctrine of direct perception of God by the nous, because he doesn't have a doctrine of uncreated energies. Scotus sees problems in Thomism, and what he does is instead of having nous and uncreated energies, he interjects the idea of univocal being. Being and reasoning, intellectual reasoning faculties are the means by which we will have a direct perception of the divine. We cannot accept that.
And by the way, Jay, it'll be helpful to point out that as you were talking about natural theology, how orthodoxy rejects that I just realized that natural theology, the consequence of that is their notion of faith-seeking understanding. You'll see this in Anselm, Fides Quaerens Intellectum. You have, this is carried all throughout the Roman Catholic Church. In the encyclical letter of John Paul II, Fides et Ratio, that you have faith in reason, and this is a total natural theology project. Faith and reason are just absolutely distinct. So they're unified, I guess they would argue, insofar as they're trying to apprehend truth, but beyond that, they're not connected in any way. And I'm glad that you referenced Staniele's book, because in chapter 1, he talks about that we do have natural revelation. That's different than natural theology. But all natural revelation is divine revelation. So we don't have these pitted categories, and you're going to see this develop within the prosologian as well, and then carried out through in Aquinas, all the way to Pope John Paul II, that somehow faith is deficient and needs to be illumined by philosophy. It hands over the project to philosophy to inquire. We don't have that. And so I just realized when you were speaking about that, this comes out of the faulty principle of natural theology as a starting point.
Yes, in fact, that is the next section in John Duns Scotus, is that he actually goes to Augustine. Now, in my opinion, what he quotes here from Augustine is not necessarily wrong, because he talks about he does make an interesting argument that that the first, if the first cause is infinite, then it does suggest that there's not there can't be multiple first causes. In other words, how can you have multiple infinites at the same time that are simple? Like, I mean, I think that kind of stands to reason. But the problem is that we have to, in other words, for the natural theology or the classical arguments to hold, we have to grant a whole bunch of things. Basically, we have to grant the Christian presuppositions that they're intending to prove. Once we grant the Christian presuppositions of the classical arguments, they kind of work, right? So we could say something like, well, if you grant the presuppositions about what perfection is, that existence is a predicate, that there is one first supernatural cause, if you grant those things, which are what the arguments are supposed to prove, if you grant them, then that you can reason out certain things that are true, correct. Like, for example, if there is a perfect first cause, then it's not lacking in what it causes, and so there can't be a secondary cause that's also the first, that's part of the first cause, right? In other words, if there's two first causes, or if this is an argument against polytheism, is where Scotus begins to move the treatise, and he says that, well, Augustine shows us that faith seeks reason, he says, and since reasoning is good, we can reason that the first cause has to be singular, because if it's double, then there's something that one side of this double cause is lacking that the other one has, and this side's lacking something that this side has, or this principle has, and so therefore it's not perfect. If it was perfect, it would have all of the efficient causal powers that it needed to affect every cause. My nose is itching. I'm not sniffing coke here before somebody says I'm a cokehead. That's what they'll say in the chat. They'll be like, oh, he's doing coke while he's talking about theology. No, I have allergies really bad. I'm in a new house and my books are moldy. Anyway, this book is old and moldy. But so infinity, if it's linked to the presuppositions about perfection, you could reason out a lot of these very interesting conclusions. But the problem, as you pointed out, is that there's not a generic conception of infinity that everybody agrees on outside of the theory of theology and the paradigm from which we come. There's not a generic conception of being. There's not a generic conception of causality or any of these principles that these guys want to start with. And the way that we know that we also can't align with this approach is that on the very next page, who does he begin to cite as sources? Avicenna, the next source, and he finds good arguments in Avicenna. Now, I'm not saying that Avicenna can never make a good argument. My point is that he's saying that Avicenna's conception of God, Aquinas' conception of God, Augustine's conception of God, and then later Maimonides' conception. He will actually cite Maimonides just like Aquinas does. When Aquinas rejects the essence energy distinction of John Damascus, who does Aquinas cite? Maimonides. He's going to cite Maimonides too. And so the reason I'm saying that is that shows you that his generic theism conception is one in which he could align with the Muslim, the Jew, the pagan, Aristotle, and all arguing for the same generic God on the basis here, not of Aquinas' basic principles, but here on the basis of generic being.
And Jay, I like what you have to say too. It's not that we're saying that the logic of these arguments don't work, that they're not good. It's the starting points. And the starting point is that, and we could just say it, going back to the West conception of fides et ratio, faith and reason, is that it's a pretended autonomy that we can let's just all pretend that for the moment that we don't need God, there is no God, and that we can actually reason. And we have these, well, what are we going to reason from? The common denominator that we all agree on, and that is either sense perception of these basic self-evident propositions, or as Duns Scotus says, the generic notion of being. And then so this is what we're questioning and critiquing, is not the logic of the argument. So I thought it was important to make that clear. But the fundamental starting point, you can't do that. You have not established either that there is a common notion among all people and all faiths. And second of all, that you can do reasoning in this kind of pretended autonomy without divine revelation. So that would be our critique. So I think it's important to state that. Not that the logic of the arguments are bad, but the starting points and the basic assumptions that they're committed to.
Yes, this is a thing that the Catholics often misunderstand, is that when we critique the presuppositions, they think we're actually denying causality. You don't believe in causality? You're crazy. You're a postmodernist. I've had Roman Catholic Thomists actually say, you're a postmodernist because you deny principles of causality, principles of purpose, and telos. No, no, no. We're not denying those things are real. We're denying that they're self-evident and that they're not theory-laden outside of some system. I mean, you could say even in a sense that they're self-evident. I mean, we're all utilizing the principles of telos and the principles of causality in the world, sure. But the question is that from a paradigmatic level, are they actually self-evident apart from a worldview wherein we can ground them or make sense of them in a holistic way? And the answer is that there's not. There's nothing about telos or causality or being, generic being, that makes it self-evident or more evident than God himself. And in fact, if we're Christians, if we believe the Bible, the revelation that we have in Scripture actually says that all those things are actually dependent upon God. I mean, how could created causal relations not be dependent upon God if we believe in the Logos Logi doctrine? If Paul is correct, and he is, and he teaches the Logos Logi doctrine, as St. John does, and then all the way into St. Maximus, then every aspect of the created world has its meaning and is grounded in the Logos. It's not grounded in human autonomous reasoning and the intellect. It's grounded in the Logos himself. And so the meaning of reality, as Father Staniloy says in chapter 1, is the Logos himself. And now you say, well, why don't we perceive that? Why don't we, when I look out at the world, I don't see that. I see sticks and rocks and trees. That's because our noose is darkened because of the fall. That's why. It's not a fault of the world revealing God. It's the fault of humans being fallen, not perceiving the world correctly due to our fallen state. Then that's the difference. So again, as Staniloy says, the content of natural revelation is the same as the content of supernatural revelation or the scriptures. The same content. That content is Jesus. He is the content of that. The triad is the content, because all reality was created from the Father through the Son and the Spirit. All reality is triadic as it exists. That's our doctrine.
Jay, let me quote a Western theologian, scientist, mathematician, who's actually one of the closest to an orthodox theology in spirit, Pascal. And Pascal says, Blaise Pascal, who's just the opposite of his contemporary René Descartes and his kind of ridiculous rationalism. And Blaise Pascal says, if it wasn't for our corrupted fallenness and our sins, there would be nothing so self-evident in the existence of God. That would be the clearest.
Amen. That's a great way to put it, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, if we think about the Logos Logi doctrine, if we understand St. Maximus's teaching on it, it leads to the conclusion of the epistemology of St. Isaac the Syrian. And that's why St. Justin Popovich wrote that essay about the epistemology of St. Isaac the Syrian being revelational, being about the content of the world is Jesus, ultimately at root. And so we can't have natural theology that's predicated on human autonomy and the fact that, oh, well, God actually doesn't make it clear that the natural world is about the Logos. The natural world's existence is through the Logos. And that's why Thomism is so dangerous and destructive, is that it attempts to look at the world from generic principles. And it actually doesn't say, Thomas is very explicit, he actually does not say that you can look at the natural world and understand revealed mysteries. But now, wait a minute. The first cause is God the Father. That should be a revealed mystery. There's nothing about God's unity that comes to us apart from God's personhood. We don't know God's unity first and then reason to him being a person on the basis of what's in Scripture. But if you follow the Summa Contra Gentiles, the argumentation in Volume 1 is of natural theology and the generic theism. And then in Volume 2, he says, now let's tack on top of that, on top of nature, we stack on top of nature the supernature, right? So understand, this whole system is built on nature, and then we tack on the revealed truths of the Trinity and the Incarnation. But this is the opposite of the way that our theology works, where the Trinity and the Incarnation come first, and then anything else that's, quote, natural, we could say revealed theology about nature is built on that. That's the other way around. So the Roman system The natural theology system is inverted.
Jay, I'm really happy that you cited St. Justin Popovich's treatise on St. Isaac the Syrian, and pertaining exactly to that concerning knowledge. Let me just read a couple quotes that really hit this perfectly. He states, rationalism separates man and his understanding, seeing the latter is the chief fount of truth and the highest measure of all that is, attributing all worth to it, making it an absolute and idolizing it, while at the same time belittling the other psychic and physical powers of man. Critical thought, for its part, is little more than apologia for a rationalism and sensualism that drags the understanding and man with it down to the level of senses. And he goes on to state, what is the foundation of the intellect and of knowledge? Man tries to explain himself in terms of things, but with a total lack of success for explaining himself in terms of things. Man, in the end, is reduced to a thing itself, to matter. He's going exactly after this Western epistemology and the problems, and that the starting point, he's pointing out that the starting point must be the Logos, must be God's divine revelation himself. So I'm really happy that you brought that up.
Yeah, I'm great that I didn't even know I didn't recall that he made that statement about things as if like, and by the way, he's pointing out the problem of empirical sense data based theology, and that's exactly what natural theology and Thomism is. So moving on then in John Duns Scotus, Scotus moves on to consider in a very philosophically dense way the first being, why he finds the Anselmian argument ultimately not convincing, even though he is interested in showing that there is a generic being, there is a first being, and that will be useful in Anselm. Anselm, for the ontological argument, also, like Scotus, has to presuppose the primacy of generic being. But Scotus does not find the argument convincing, and so instead he argues on the basis of causal chain and the cosmological argument, and he gives this extended treatise presentation about how the first being has to be primary, efficient, he has to be the final cause, he has to be the immanent cause. So again, only if we grant all of these assumptions about causal relations would we admit that this argument is sound. But again, in my view, the causal chain argument can't prove something outside of a natural series of causes unless you presuppose Christianity, and that's what it's intended to do. So I think it's useless. I would add, too, that this whole approach is wrong because it does not start with God as person. This is another problem with a different order of theology. We mentioned this with Calvinism. We mentioned it with Thomism. Unfortunately, another reason that the Scotus approach does not work with Orthodox theology is that it is also a theology that it's an order of theology based on essentialism, based on existence, based on being, as if that's the primary category. And so he will reason from God as the first super simple essence, and then he'll tack on other attributes that he thinks are rationally, logically to follow from that. So he'll say, well, the first being has to be infinite, he has to be uncaused, he has to be perfect, he has to be simple, he has to be omniscient, omnipotent. And so he talks about these kind of generic categories, he uses his generic theism to tack on then these attributes that natural theology thinks can be teased out of assuming the first cause. Now, I don't think that those logically follow because, they do logically follow if you're a Christian. But the problem is that these arguments are intended to eventually lead you to Christianity, but they don't because they lead you to a generic God that is not the Christian God. And the reason it's not the Christian God is because all of these other world religions, they don't have the proper Trinitarian and Christological theology that we do. You have to have, for example, the essence-energy distinction. Orthodoxy is the only world religion that has a real belief in the essence-energy distinction. All of the other world religions don't, and they presuppose some form of absolute simplicity, where all of the names of the attributes are identical to who he is, And that's the next point, is that, guess what? Scotus is very clear that God's attributes, maybe not all of them, are absolutely and actually identical to the essence. Now, he does think that some of the attributes can be distinguished and that the distinction is not purely formal, purely conceptual.
Virtual. Yeah.
It's not purely virtual. However, in the treatise, I have to stress this, and I shared these on Twitter, but if you didn't catch them, on page 56 of this volume, under the existence of God, under the second conclusion, I establish it as follows. The knowledge and the will of the first being are the exact same as its essence. So he actually agrees totally with Aquinas on that point. And what's his proof? Is it the Bible? No, it's Aristotle. Aristotle in Book 13 of Metaphysics says the essence of this first being must be the same as its existence. If it was not, it would not be the best substance because it would be composed. That's absolute divine simplicity. There you go. And so he goes on to say, we have many reasonings to establish this, not just on the basis of Aristotle, but many logical arguments, he says. He goes again to Aristotle. He says the conclusion is that the divine essence is absolutely identical with its will, and this is a fruitful doctrine because of its corollaries, the things that flow from this. Well, what are the things that flow from this doctrine? He says, the self-knowledge of this being is identical with its nature also. For nothing is loved unless it is known. Hence, so here we have this weird Western doctrine of God loving himself the most, and that's the most perfect version. Like, I think Metropolitan Herotheus, has critiqued this weird idea, but this is something that's in Aquinas as well, that God loves himself the most. Therefore, knowledge, as it were, is more closely connected with this essence than it is with will, and therefore it follows in third place that the intellect of this being is also the same as its nature. We prove this in the same way as follows. Fourthly, that whatever is required for this nature to know itself, it is also identical with the nature. For if the knowledge exists in virtue of itself, then the same is true of the reason for knowing, and therefore it must be known in the first intellect. Having thus proved that this self-knowledge and self-love of the first being are the same as its essence, I will go on to show the same to be true of other acts of this being, namely that all of this being's knowledge and its acts of volition, and that the knowledge, no knowledge can be of an accident to the first nature. So created beings, then he says, are accidental. They possess substance and accident. The first being cannot possess accident, and therefore it is pure act. This is on page 59. So he actually uses the actus purus argumentation, where he states that the existence of this being is absolutely identical to its essence. He is his essence. He is his existence. Nature is person. Nature is existence. Nature is act. Nature is will. Very clear. Now, again, our critique of Thomism, just like our critique of John Duns Scotus, is not that he never says things that are correct. It's not that he never gets something right. The critique is that there's conflicting ideas at work here. He recognizes a problem in Aquinas. It's a problem that we recognize in Aquinas. The problem is that his solution still utilizes the assumptions of actus purus, of absolute divine simplicity, of equating the will of God with the essence of God, other attributes with the essence of God, and predicating absolute divine simplicity to be the case, as he says at the same time, but I also want to have a formal distinction in the attributes to avoid the stupidity, the error of the Aquinas position, which says that will in God is the same as knowledge in God, is the same as foreknowledge in God, and is the same as the essence of God. He says he has the same critique that Palamism has in the debate, where he says if Aquinas is right, then all the attributes are the same, and we can't distinguish them, and it's useless. It's useless to say that in reality there's no distinction. So he comes up with a median position that's not Palamism, that's not Aquinas. He says the distinction is formal and not real. We believe the distinction is real. We don't believe in a formal distinction, because the formal distinction, which is an attempt to have a midway, still doesn't work. Why does it still not work? Because he still affirms absolute divine simplicity and all the problems that we've outlined in Aquinas.
Yeah, that's an interesting. I'm trying to figure out how Scotus would answer. He's going to assume that infinite being is one. Now, if you have formal distinctions that are many, how is he going to reconcile? Because forms is separating a being. And I mean, you would know this better than I do about Scotus, but it seems to be problematic.
Well, that's what I'm saying. It is problematic. So here is an attempt by the Canterbury. So here's where they discuss this problem. This is the guys I was reading earlier. I forget what their names were. Tanner and somebody. Anyway, it says, Scotus agrees with other theologians that God's unconditional actuality rules out having any parts. There can be no composition. There can be no act and potency in the divine God. There's no real distinctions as to divine substance. But he argues that there can still be real differences without real distinctions among God's attributes. So there we see it is not reconcilable with Palamos, according to just standard evaluations from Scotus on John Duns Scotus. For among things distinct in conception, there are some that, although inseparably realized in God's case, are separately definable and separately realized amongst finite things. For example, attributes of rationality, goodness, and wisdom. Moreover, the tendencies of the prudent man are distinct from those of the intelligent man, even when they coincide. So the attributes cannot be merely conceptual and definitionally distinct. That would be the Thomist view. The unity of the infinite being is more than that of a mere simplicity or a lack of composition. Scotus says the simplicity of God is a perfection. It does not follow that every simple creature is more perfect than those not simple. In addition, actuality is also a perfection. Actuality is more perfect than simplicity in his mind. The infinite being has the unity of complete actuality. The necessarily first being maximizes this actuality. For this and other purposes in his metaphysics and theology, Scotus reasons that there is often a difference in reality that is not great enough to amount to a real distinction, but is greater than a conceptual distinction. This is his formal distinction. For instance, he thought that there are features that really differ and are sometimes separately realizable, such as wisdom and justice, even though actually inseparably in the unity of the one being, the way that intuitive and deductive intelligence might belong to a single person. Such formal distinctions are, one, separately knowable, at least within and without. This is kind of getting confusing with word salad. Within, without what? Their difference is real, independently of our mere thoughts. None can in a given thing exist on its own, so the attributes don't exist on their own, independently of the other attributes. And four, each one of them is perfectly the same and is related to the same being. So he's kind of saying what Palamos says here, that God is fully present in every one of his energies, but the energies really are distinct. But that's where Scotus will not go, to say that, no, the energies are not distinct. But let me add here, Scotus thinks, and this is the next paragraph, says that Scotus thinks there would be a contradiction if we affirmed Aquinas' position that they are all the attributes are only conceptually distinct, which he's correct. We would agree with that. But let's keep in mind that the essence-energy distinction is not just about speculations about divine names. The essence-energy distinction relates to the sacraments. The essence-energy distinction relates to uncreated grace, because that's what you partake in. The essence-energy distinction relates to Christology. You cannot have correct Christology, correct sacramentology, correct doctrine of the church, correct Christology, or any of that. You can't have any of that without the essence-energy distinction. So it's not just about reasoning about God. And this is what most of the Roman Catholics don't understand, is that when you read John Damascus, by book 3, he's taken the essence-energy distinction and applied it to Christology. St. Maximus does. The Sixth Council does. So it's not just about reasoning directly about God. How does God relate to the world? It's absolutely, fully, totally realized in the incarnation. You cannot have correct Christology without the essence-energy distinction. And that's what none of the Roman Catholics accept. And by the way, when they do understand and accept that, they become Orthodox. So what I'm saying is that even if we do find a correct critique of Aquinas in Scotus, it does not follow that the rest of the Scotus position is at all reconcilable with Orthodoxy.
Yeah, correct. And Scotus's argument, it seems bad. So he's going to, correct me if I'm wrong, he's going to say that what were the two virtues that he named that can exist?
I think he said wisdom and justice.
Wisdom and justice. So the assumption on Scotus and all our views, created being is divided in multiple. God is absolutely one. So what does he do? He says, well, in what way can God be absolutely one? And all of these attributes apply not only univocally, but that's exactly what the essence is. When we predicate, well, let's go to divided being to make it, and then come back and apply that to, does that not sound like a really bad argument?
Well, it seems circular. I mean, so we're trying to reason about the unique way in which God can have a formal distinction in his attributes, and yet Scotus, again, as we saw in the treatise, vehemently still wants to believe in absolute divine simplicity. And so it's just an attempt to reconcile something and it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because absolute divine simplicity is not reconcilable with real distinctions. And he needs real distinctions because, and this is one of the easiest way to prove real distinctions, as I often point out, is to look at things like the action of God creating the world. Now, we know the Thomists all smush everything into cause and effect. Well, God's the cause and the world is the effect. So as it relates to the world, the effect is distinct, and so therefore God is not the same as his causes. That's not what we're actually talking about, the action itself, right? So because we believe God's actions are distinct from God himself and his essence. So when God creates the world, that action has to be specific. It can't be an eternal action, right? So the actions of God, if they're synonymous with the divine essence, then the action of creating the world is synonymous with the divine essence and is therefore eternal, and it's an essentialist emanation. That would be Platonism.
Right?
That's Origenism, correct. That's Platonism.
So that's why it's good to point that out.
Absolutely.
Origen's is being consistent with this starting point.
Yeah, Origen was being consistent, correct. And so were the Eunomians. They just went in different directions. So were the Arians. They were all just taking ADS and going in different directions.
Right.
Now, when we come to, so if we think about the action of creating the world as a distinct action in the past, it's not something that God kept doing. There's not infinite worlds. He created this world. And then we think about Christology, and that's a divine person acting within history, within time and space. Jesus is a divine person acting within time and space. He really was incarnate. Is Jesus walking on water, which St. John Damascus says is an action proper to his divinity? Is that the same action as creating the world? No, obviously not. So there really are different actions of God. That's the easiest, simplest way to disprove the Thomist conception of all of the actions of God being identical to the essence of God. It's that easy. And then again, just read the Florovsky essay where he shows that St. Athanasius used the essence energy distinction argument against the Arians. The whole point of the argument against the Arians is to show that the action of generating the sun is a different action from the action of creating the world. If all the actions of God are identical, then there's no difference between generating the world and creating the sun. The sun's either a creature or the world is equivalent to the sun. It's an eternally generated, emanated thing. So the formal distinction, as we said, of Scotus therefore does not achieve what it attempts to achieve. It's a noble attempt, you could say, perhaps, to try to find a way out of the box of Thomism. But I think something you pointed out in our past talks was that, I forget how you said it, but you said something like, we as Orthodox, we use Aristotle in a different way, and we use it such that we don't have to be boxed into a cause-effect view of God to where God is only conceived of as substance and no accident. We can look at these as different windows of how we view God, and so we can talk about God in an Aristotelian way at times, and then at other times not be boxed into viewing God as a purely Aristotelian framework.
Right, that's exactly what it was referencing, the point that it's impossible for anybody to be wrong 100%, 100% of the time, and therefore we can still use different truths when people from different paradigms speak truth. But when you take what the West has done, particularly Roman Catholicism, and then obviously Protestantism is going to inherit that. And you start with the starting points. You assume the starting points, and therefore the entire metaphysics, there is nowhere else to go. This is why the Thomist doesn't like Anselm, because he has Platonic starting points. You can't do, the two are incompatible because they have an Aristotelian metaphysics and starting point. So they're trapped within a box. We Orthodox aren't. We can say, yeah, when it's useful, we can use act and potency and these various things and cause and effect, but we're not committed to it. You don't have to. We're not going to end up in some crazy Thomistic defining of transubstantiation of the body of Christ with regards to substance and accidents. We don't have to. They have to commit to that.
Yeah, I think that if you look at the whole scheme of the Summa, it's very different from what you see in St. John Damascus. I mean, St. John Damascus is the preeminent example of how we would approach Aristotle in the correct way. And not just Aristotle, but other fathers like Dionysius the Areopagite who did utilize philosophy. So it's not that we are having a problem with Aristotle, Plato, or the people in terms of everything they say. It's that we're not confining ourselves to one philosophic scheme of Aristotelianism, and that's absolutely what happens as Leo XIII actually says that the philosophy of Aquinas is the official philosophy of the Roman Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. And as we move into the periods in which Roman Catholic theology does dogmatize absolute divine simplicity. So this is the key point that we also make against the Uniates, is that it's not just a matter of we're being unfair and saying that Roman Catholic theology doesn't have a place for Scotism. I recognize that Roman Catholic theology is a big umbrella, but that's part of the problem, is that the umbrella is about allowing contradictory things. And so Palamos can be viewed as a heretic for centuries, and then under John Paul and his ecumenical umbrella, suddenly now Palamos is a saint and a church father. You can be a Uniate and not believe in Trent and purgatory. But wait, you're supposed to, because Trent and purgatory, those are universal dogmas. I mean, it makes no sense, right? The double-mindedness of the Uniate is just like the double-mindedness of the SSPX, where you can reject the universal ordinary magisterium of the Pope as you say you affirm the Pope. And it's the exact same thing in Uniatism, where views have been heretical for centuries. But now because of ecumenism, they're okay. It's just not coherent. It's not consistent. It doesn't make any sense. And that's why even the big umbrella of the papacy, I mean, they now think that people who were Nestorian, other Monophysites, they'll have liturgies that revere Nestorians and Monophysites under the umbrella of the papacy. It makes no sense. It's incoherent. It only makes sense if you understand that the papacy scheme is a giant umbrella scheme, and that all of Uniatism was an attempt to just trick Orthodox to coming under the political power of the Pope.
Absolutely. And the generic God, the monad.
Yeah, I mean, this is not just head stuff. It's not just academics. It really does filter into the theology. And I mean, this comes to a head especially when you have the debate between the Barlaamite and St. Gregory of Palamos. I mean, for the Orthodox Church, this has already been determined. It's already been debated. It's already been settled. We can't unite with Thomism because even Gennadius Scholarios, the most pro-Thomist, said that we could never accept his rejection of the essence-energy distinction. And St. John Damascus teaches the essence-energy distinction. There's absolutely no doubting that. And Aquinas rejects it. I've shown this many, many, many times. It's in many articles. But again, so if we were to compare Scotus to this treatise, which, by the way, most of these Uniates, they don't talk about it. They won't read it because Palamos says that Roman Catholicism is heresy. He says that they're heretics and they're condemned by the Palamite synods here. So you can't accept this if our pillars of orthodoxy say that it's heresy. There's no way to combine these. It's oil and water. They don't mix. And that's what we need the Uniates and we need the ecumenists to understand, is that these two systems are irreconcilable. And so, again, if we were to read Scotus, and I'll finish up with this last point and then we'll move on to Anselm. Scotus moves on to discuss human reasoning up from nature, but he says that we can also cite authorities. And who would you think would be his authority to go to about the unity of God? why, well, he does cite Deuteronomy, to be fair to him, but then he cites Rabbi Maimonides. Interesting. So all the trads get so mad, they call us, they call Orthodox people Kabbalists. And who do we see? John Duns Scotus citing right away Maimonides. And who does Aquinas cite in the treatise De Veritate on the unity of God? Well, he cites Rabbi Maimonides against John Damascus. What clearer argument could you have that they are siding with classical theism against the essence-energy distinction? And by the way, it is absolutely Rabbi Maimonides. And then he goes on in this treatise, Unicity of God, which I said is only about 15, 20 pages. He goes on to argue on the basis of the absolute divine simplicity presuppositions that the first being must be actus purus. He is the true, the good, the being, and he possesses those things in fullness so that he can be the most perfect being. So that's what we see with Scotus. We don't see any real refuge or we see one good critique of Aquinas, which we share with Scotus, but that's not enough. I'm sorry, that's not enough for us to say, well, then let's combine with Franciscans and Scotus, because the rest of the system, everything else, is absolute divine simplicity, created grace. All the same problems are still there.
Well done, Jay. That was a good critique. Appreciate that.
Would you? So let's move to you now. I have some things I would mention about Anselm. I mentioned a little bit earlier, but why don't you tell us about the ontological argument? Lay it out for us. Tell us what you think about it. What are its strengths? What are its weaknesses? And let's talk about whether this is a better approach. Does it fail? Does it achieve anything? What do you think?
Yeah, let me start first by I don't actually personally think it's an ontological argument, but I have my critique of it. It can be ontological in a loose sense if we're talking about the Greek word ontos, being. So one of my critiques, and I know this will probably be your critique as well, is this presupposition about being, that this kind of self-evident. The difference between Anselm and Aquinas and Scotus and the rest is Anselm's going to be pulling from more Platonic thought and Neoplatonic thought. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. But let me first just give my argument why I don't think it's an ontological argument. So the first person to actually make that phrase ontological argument is Immanuel Kant within the Critique of Pure Reason. And he says there are two unique conditions for qualifying something being ontological. It's when we start with a concept within the mind alone, and from the meaning of that concept, immediately, and that's going to be important, immediately conclude the existence of that outside of the mind. And number two condition, without any recourse to sense experience, then an argument's ontological. Now, it's very clear who Immanuel Kant had in mind when he was referring to the ontological argument, and that was René Descartes. René Descartes presents two types of ontological argument. I think it'll suffice for our purposes just to go over the one that he starts with talking about, for example, well, what is the essence of a triangle, i.e. the meaning, the concept in the mind? It's a three-sided geometrical figure whose angles equal 180 degrees. Can you conceive of triangle apart from three-sidedness? No, you can't. Then Descartes immediately goes to say, well, what is the meaning in the concept of God? It is necessary being. What is necessary being? A being who cannot not exist. So just as you cannot conceive of the essence of a triangle apart from its three-sidedness, you cannot conceive of God apart from existence. This is why Kant's critique is existence can't be a predicate, is one of his critiques of the ontological argument. Now, when I look at Anselm's argument, it doesn't seem to have those qualifications that are laid out by Immanuel Kant. And therefore, on those grounds, I could say it's not ontological. You could say it's ontological in a loose sense, again, by saying it's related to being, the presupposition of what being and the gradations of being. But Anselm starts off with saying he does not have because Descartes says we have a positive conception or concept of what God is. Anselm's different because he starts off, and this is something that we could appreciate, with an apophatic formula that God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. Id quod meus cogitare nequit in the Latin. And so the second reason why I would say it's not an ontological argument, so he doesn't start with a positive apprehension of a concept of essence. Number two, that he doesn't immediately conclude. So watch how Descartes, as soon as you understand the meaning and essence of God, God exists. Anselm has at least 6 or 7, if you laid it out in a deductive form. He actually puts it in a reductio form within the prosologium. If you lay it out in a deductive form, there's at least 6 or 7 premises. So maybe I'm just splitting hairs, but by that, again, ontological argument was first given by that term by Immanuel Kant. It's referring to Descartes. And second of all, it does not fit the qualifications or standards that Immanuel Kant lays out for ontological. And therefore, it's not an ontological argument. Now, later thinkers will develop ontological arguments that, and notice how it's different. It does not start off with in an apophatic formula. They'll say, God is the greatest being, or the greatest thing that can be conceived. And one of those perfections is being. So the starting point's different. So again, I think we can appreciate that Anselm starts the formula of God in an apophatic way. So let me just go through. You want me to just lay out the argument real quick?
Yeah, please do.
For the listeners? For the listeners and the viewers? Okay. Let me just, so to make it easier, let me just put it in not its reductio.
Let me, by the way, I don't want you to get distracted. I'm going to have to wee really quick. So I'm going to let you lay out the argument. I'll be listening, so I'm not ignoring you, but don't get distracted because I'm stepping away really quick. I'll be right back.
Okay. So again, Anselm starts off with God is called that than which nothing greater can be thought. Id quod meus cogitare nequit. So it sounds really strange because you've got a lot of pronouns in there. That, which, and you have a comparison to than. So he starts off, God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. Excuse me. God, that than which nothing greater can be thought. Let's make it easier. Let's just call it X. That X is that than which nothing greater can be thought. X can be thought, premise 2. You might ask, well, how do you know that? I know it because I thought it. I just thought X. Number 3, which is going to follow from premise 2, is that, well, X is a thought. If you can think something, at least in a very loose sense, it's a thought. And where do thoughts exist? On the bottom of my shoes, in my glass. Thoughts exist in the mind. Premise 4. So that's going to follow from premise 2 and 3. Now watch this move that Anselm makes here. He then says, well, it's greater. And you could ask, well, greater in what sense? But let's just say quantitatively. Now, this still has a connection to being. And the presupposition that he starts with, this kind of Platonic notion of being, is that there is this kind of gradation of being. being in thought only. And so he has this analogy of, imagine you're a painter and you have this idea in your mind, but you haven't executed it yet on canvas. Or you have a fictional character. Now, could you say completely that has no being whatsoever? No, it has some type of being. Perhaps, and this is using the kind of Platonic language and notions, it's the lowest form of being. Well, what would be greater than that? Well, when the painter then goes and executes his idea that's in his mind, and now you have something existing in the mind, and then you have something existing on the canvas. So here you get a second degree of being. So that's greater than just existing in the mind alone. And then it'll conclude, and this is definitely Platonic, that the greatest, the highest degree of being is that which is but can in no way be in the mind. And we'll see that'll play an important part later in his argument. So to return, we're back with premise 4, and premise 4 says that X is in the mind. Now, it's nice to use the term X because you could counter, let's say, an objection that says, well, you're presupposing God, his existence, and that's what you want to prove. So just call it X. We don't know. X is that than which nothing greater can be thought. It's a thought, and therefore it's in my mind. Premise 4. Premise 5, it is greater, quantitatively, going back to the analogy of the painter, to exist in the mind and in reality than just the mind alone. So this is to counter, this is to set up, it's going to counter the atheist that says that God's just a flying spaghetti monster. Your imaginary, invisible God, it's just in your mind. Well, Anselm's going to make this argument that, well, it's, premise 5, it's greater to exist in the mind in reality than just the mind alone. So why is he saying that? Because X cannot, therefore, exist solely in the mind. Why? Because, if you remember, part of the meaning of that than which nothing greater can be thought always admits of a greater. So if you said, my greatest possible thought, this is why he doesn't form it into a cataphatic positive formula. Because say, well, God's the greatest thing that I can think. Well, then it's just, it could be still in your mind. But when you put it in an apophatic formula, because that in which nothing greater can be thought, and therefore always admits of a greater, that if you think God is the greatest possible being and it exists in your mind, that in which nothing greater can be thought is greater than that, and therefore must exist outside the mind as well. So that's why he's putting it in an apophatic formula. Therefore, X must exist in reality as well as in the mind. How do we know that? Because, again, the formula that than which nothing greater can be thought always admits of a greater. And if it's greater to exist in the mind and in reality, then X must exist in reality as well as the mind. X is what we call God, therefore God exists outside of our mind in reality. So that's kind of the deductive form of, I don't know if that's helpful to, I do it in a kind of that deductive rather than just the reductio, because sometimes people have a difficult time with reductio arguments. So I found that might be more fruitful to put it in kind of a straightforward kind of deductive syllogism.
Yeah, no, that's a great explanation. A lot of people will describe this argument in various ways. That was really good. So my first question would be, it seems to rest on the assumption of existence as a predicate, being as a predicate, and the idea of gradations of perfection, right? In other words, why do we know? And I think this is one of Kant's criticisms of the argument, was that on what basis do we actually know that a being that exists in reality is more perfect or more a more better. He's more better, right? We don't actually know that. The argument assumes that. Now, it may be the case that it is better to exist in reality than only in the mind or in conception or something like that, or in the mind and in reality. But the argument rests on that epistemic and metaphysical assumption that is not yet demonstrated. So it kind of falls prey right away to the critiques that we could have of the classical arguments, typically speaking. Like, the way Hume critiques the cosmological argument is that if you don't want to start with your sense experience, I know this argument is not starting with sense experience, it's more Platonic, but it's the same type of critique, which is that you're assuming a lot of philosophically heavy baggage that hasn't really been demonstrated yet.
That's exactly right. So that's why I gave out of the prosologian, I wish I had my prosologian with me, but he references the three gradations of being through using this kind of metaphor of a painter. And anybody that knows this stuff will know that that's Neoplatonic thought right there. About being, about the gradations of being. So you're absolutely right, Jay, that the critique of Anselm could be, well, I'm not granting your starting point. Neoplatonic or Platonic starting point about the way we're to conceive of being and gradation and what's greater or less. Then it falls apart. You're mute. You're mute, Ben.
I've got my proslogian here, and
Sweet.
So he talks about, in many ways, by the way, there's quite a few sort of absolute divine simplicity type statements here that we also couldn't accept because, as he progresses into chapter 17, 18, and 19, he's arguing for just an absolutely simple, perfect essence, right? Now, he does eventually attribute personality and personhood to this being, but by chapter 23, he said, it's the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit who is this equally good, perfect essence and all that. The supreme simple, the supreme unity, the supreme one, and on and on and on. Again, not that we have a problem with the unity of God. It's just that, ironically, it kind of it still falls prey, I would say, to some of the critiques that we would make of absolute divine simplicity, because and that was the critique I took in my essay when I critiqued it, was that it still it assumes that the one that we're talking about here is that unity is in some way preeminent over multiplicity. I would argue that just like in the Christology, the of Anselm in Cor Deus Homo 1.9, you have the divinity overtaking and supplanting the human. There's a similarity with the unity in God. The unity in some way is more primary, more metaphysically prior, more. There's a greater aspect to unity than there is to multiplicity, and ultimately, this is the problem of all Roman Catholic theology. So I actually touched on that in my critique. I think I put that in the chat earlier. If anybody wants to read my critique, I listed the argument from Anselm, and then went on to talk about how. While there is an a priorist aspect to this that's interesting, I would agree with Father Deacon Dr. Ananias. After those critiques of I'm looking through my essay here. What it argues for is first and foremost a supremely simple being. So it still includes the generic notions of theism. It's just that, like we saw with Scotus, we're starting with conceptions of being that are seen to be perfect, preeminent, most perfect, like Scotus has. That even though Scotus doesn't accept the argument, it's still utilizing conceptions of being as primary. But being is not a predicate of the divine essence, right? Being is, for us, an energy of God. So it doesn't work ultimately. In other words, we had, I think I mentioned this to you, we had a guy who specialized in this argument, and I think you knew who he was, but he actually came to my university when I was an undergrad, and he gave a lecture on how, if you followed through with the ontological argument, what it actually proves is a unity of perfect being. If you follow through the argument, it doesn't prove a personal God. It proves generic monad oneness And actually, theologians after Anselm who did go with this tradition, like Malebranche, this guy was a specialist in Malebranche. He argued that Malebranche actually took the argument in a more consistent way with absolute simplicity and argued that really it just proves ontologism. And in Denzinger, there's a later condemnation of the conclusions of the ontologists. I don't have my Denzinger here beside me. I could go get it, but you can find the condemnations of Malebranche on the ontologists in the post-Tridentine period of Denzinger. And that's because ultimately, if absolute divine simplicity is true, even in the Anselmian view, because the Anselmian Augustinian tradition in the Latin Church is not really different than the view of simplicity in the Thomistic tradition. It's also, as we saw, not different in the Scotus position. It's still absolute divine simplicity. And so what it ends up proving is a kind of generic monad, if you granted the presuppositions. That's my view. It doesn't actually prove the Trinity. So again, it's the right idea of moving in the right direction away from empirical argumentation, trying to prove God and the Trinity through empirical sense data. That's not really going to work. So it's a step in the right direction.
But there's going to be, after you're done, I'll show that there's going to be a problem.
I'm done. You go ahead.
So one of the critiques, and then I'll so that I don't straw man Anselm, show how he would respond to that, and then formulate, therefore, my own critique of Anselm, what he does with the argument. So right after, I'm trying to remember what, so he presents the ontological argument, or if you want to just call it Anselm's argument, in chapter 3, where God truly exists. Is that correct? If you have the proslogium, I'm just going off memory.
Let me pull it out here. I got it. I put it up. What was that again in chapter 3?
I think it's chapter 3. It's entitled God Truly Exists, or God, is that chapter 3?
2 is God truly exists, and then 3 is God cannot be thought not to exist.
Okay, so that's exactly what I wanted to know. So after he establishes that, well, what do we mean by God? That in which nothing greater can be thought. It can be thought, but it's
and I'm sorry. That's what I was trying to get to at in my criticism. I got lost in my train of thought. Is that what we're starting with is a rational conception of God, and not God revealed as I am that I am, the Father, the personal Father, revealing himself through the Son and the Spirit. The beginning point of this ordo of apologetic, you could say, is that God is that which nothing greater can be conceived. That's not who God is, by the way.
Yeah. And Anselm says that he received this kind of in a meditative prayer. So I could see our opponents saying, well, he did start with faith. And then because he was meditating in this prayer in his cell, his monastic cell, God, you're so great. You're greater than all this. You're greater than you're greater than anything that can be conceived or thought. But the problem is his fides quaerens intellectum, that he therefore then hands over what he received in faith to a pretended rational autonomy to, now let's just prove it. So that's one critique.
Well, but again, God is not that which nothing. I mean, you could say that there's a sense in which that's true. I mean, is it true that God, you can't conceive of anything greater than God? Yeah. But is that what and who God is? No.
That's an excellent point. Yeah. And that's going to follow from, again, an absolute divine simplicity model of which he commits to. So, again, you say, well, it just exists in the mind. Well, it's greater to exist in the mind and in reality. Therefore, it must exist in reality. So chapter 2, he served the purpose he set out for himself. Therefore, it must exist in reality. But chapter 3 then goes on to say, but God can in no way exist in the mind. So here is a possible objection that's going to be mounted. Well, wait a minute. What is a contradiction when you affirm and deny a subject at the same time in the same way? Didn't you just tell me that that than which nothing greater can be thought is in the mind? Chapter 3, you tell me, but it can no way be in the mind. That looks like a contradiction. I expect that Anselm would respond, well, contradiction is affirming and denying a subject at the same time and in the same way. And so when I say that God exists in the mind, and then saying he can no way exist in the mind, I don't seem saying the same way. So what you could say is, in chapter 2, when we start with not assuming God's existence in reality, that therefore it just exists in the mind alone, that this is sort of a self-referential statement. So what exists in the mind? The sign, the formula, but not the thing signified. Then later, the conclusion of the argument would be, now the thing must exist outside the mind, the thing signified. In chapter 3, the thing signified can no way be in the mind. So, okay, I'm doing this because I'm trying not to straw man his argument and get accused of, okay, fair enough. Let's grant Anselm that, okay, you're being equivocal in the sense of existing in the mind, and it can no way exist in the mind. And therefore, you avoid the accusations of an implicit contradiction or the explicit contradiction. But the problem is, right after that, as you pointed out, so if God can no way exist in the mind, there's no predicates that he's completely committed to an apophaticism such that no predicates could even attach to God. Because he's always existing outside of the mind, because any predicate therefore exists in the mind, and obviously God exists outside of the mind. Well, what does he do right after that? He just waves his magic wand, and much like Aquinas does, and starts attaching all this kind of cataphatic terminology to God. He's supreme good. He's supreme, but I thought you said you couldn't do that. And it presents a very confusing.
Do you remember where he's saying that that God doesn't exist in the mind, or is he saying that God doesn't only exist in the mind?
Chapter 3. Yeah, let me see if I can find. I think chapter 3. And again, this is going to go back to his presupposition, which we're going to deny. This kind of Neoplatonic presupposition of 3 degrees of being, the lowest degree of being in the mind alone, the second degree of being in the mind and in reality, and the third and highest degree of being, which would be being in reality, but in no way in the mind. So I thought he might have argued that in chapter 3. So, okay, hold on a second. So he basically says it remains unthinkable.
Yeah, I'm looking at. So yeah, I mean he says certainly this being so truly exists that it cannot even be thought not to exist. For something can be thought to exist that cannot be thought not to exist. And this is greater than that which can be thought not to exist. Right? So being in existence is greater than being in mere thought. Hence, if that than which nothing greater can be conceived can be thought not to exist, then that than which a greater cannot be thought is not the same as that than which a greater cannot be thought, which is absurd. Something which is a greater cannot be thought exists, so truly then it cannot even be thought not to exist. So this is the key clincher of the argument, that for it to truly be great, it must also exist in reality, not just in the mind.
That's chapter 2, right?
This is 3. He says, Then you, Lord, are this very being, because you exist truly. Lord God, you cannot even be thought not to exist. And this is as it should be, for if some intelligence could think of something better than you, then the creature would be above its creator and would be able to judge its creator, and that is absurd. In fact, everything else there is, except you alone, can be thought of as not existing. You alone, then, of all the things that most truly exist, and therefore of all things possessing existence to the highest degree, for anything else does not exist as truly, and so possesses existence to a lesser degree. Why then did the fool say in his heart that there is no God, when it is so evident to any rational mind that you of all things exist to the highest degree? Why indeed, unless because he was a stupid fool?
Yeah, that's not where. What's chapter 4? What's the title of chapter 4? Because I remember he goes on. So that's sufficient.
4 is where he says, the fool has said in his heart that which cannot be thought. Indeed, he has said in his heart what he. Go ahead.
That's it. That's
okay.
It. It's in chapter 4. Because then, because notice he's playing up that which cannot be thought, and I think he's going to state in there cannot be thought, but we shouldn't assume that that which cannot be thought does not exist. Why? Because it rests on the foundational assumption that he has that there's 3 degrees of being. Lowest degree of being in the mind alone, second degree mind and reality, and the third highest degree of being in reality, but in no way exists in the mind. So I think he might have said that in 4. I wish I had. You'd think I'd grabbed my.
Well, yeah. I mean, if we follow through with granting a lot of these presuppositions, again, what we're having to grant from the outset is that we all have the same conception of God, that we all have the highest conceivable possible being. Well, we don't know what being is. We also don't know that what's in our mindscape actually matches up to the being in reality. Now, I'm not saying that our view of God in Orthodox theology, for example, that we don't have true beliefs about God, that our transcendental argument doesn't match up to the God that actually exists. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that for this to be an argument where we start, we have to grant a whole bunch of things. And that's why, again, the transcendental argument, in my view, is superior to this argument as well, even though there's some interesting turns here, and it's interesting to start with a more a priori argument, because the transcendental argument is more of an a priori argument. It's not strictly a priori, because we're not Platonists. We're not arguing that, we're going to start with the human mind as to how we get to God. That's not the transcendental argument. A lot of people misunderstand that. You're doing some kind of ontological type of thing. No, we're not starting with human reasoning, autonomy. We're starting with revelation. We're saying that the worldview that's presented on the basis of Orthodox Christianity is true, and that God is true, because that's the one that can ground all of these things that we utilize. Time, space, causality, morals, ethics, aesthetics, knowledge. All those things can be grounded and made coherent in that worldview. And so it's not the same thing as saying, let's sit back on a recliner like Kant and Plato and Anselm, and let's speculate, and let's see if we can reason out in our minds what is the most perfect thing, what is the highest conception of a thing, what is the generic conception of being according to Scotus, what's the causal chain that we can think up. We're not doing that. It's actually an anti-rationalist argument, even though some people think, transcendental arguments, that's a bunch of Kant, that's a bunch of rationalism. No, it's not. It's actually very, very, very practical. The easiest way to see the practicality of this argument is to point out that it's ethical, right? These arguments aren't actually, you could argue Anselm's is ethical, but cosmological arguments, they're not inherently ethical. Maybe the first cause is Satan, right? Maybe the first cause is a giant universal fart. Who knows? So there's nothing inherently ethical about a being that's not personal. We need the God of our system that we're arguing for to be personal God, so that we have then a reason why it's wrong to go against what's true, right? So in other words, metaphysics presupposes ethics. Ethics presupposes
by the way, Jay, the objector is going to say, but wait a minute. Aquinas' fourth way of gradation admits of a moral aspect through gradation. But you could respond, here's the problem. It doesn't become clear at all that any of those 5 ways are referring to the same entity.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Now, he goes later on to try to argue that these have to be the same entity. I don't think successfully, though.
Well, actually, I would argue, too, that it's really only a presuppositional type of philosophy that understands that ethics and metaphysics and epistemology are intimately and necessarily connected and related. So even though Aquinas might make that move, I'm not sure on Aquinas' system that he could make that move. So he may do that, and I mean, he does this kind of stuff many times over. But is he actually justified in including ethics in that version of the argument that he makes?
Because in the fourth wave, he talks about what's better than something else or what's worse. Again, is granting this assumption.
Granting the assumptions, yes.
That we all just have this same understanding. We just look and just intuitively know things that are better and worse. But that's not true. Look at different people's religions and paradigms and worldviews. It is clearly not true that people...
Right.
I think this is good. I don't. I think it's evil.
Exactly. And let's hammer this home point, too, because we get mistaken critiques from both sides of things, which is that you're too academic, you're too philosophical. Well, listen, I'm going to quote to you from the Triads about the very first point about Platonism and Greek Hellenic thought being demonic. So this is where the trads get mad, right? So the Orthodox, we have some Orthodox people say, "Oh, you're too academic. It's too academic." No, we're actually saying that these Greeks are kooks. They have some insights. There's nothing inherently wrong with philosophy itself. God created all things. God is the origin of the love of wisdom. God is wisdom. Philosophy, philosophia, right? So that's not the problem.
Can you point out that I know this sounds hyper academic and rational, and it wouldn't have to be if there weren't academics and philosophers that we had to refute. So, I mean,
Great point.
You're not supposed to understand what they're teaching and promoting. You have to be able to understand the philosophies to be able to refute them.
Yeah, I mean, most of the patristic philosophic discourses are against goofy philosophers, right? I mean, you have this 800,000-page treatise of St. Gregory of Nyssa against Eunomius. It's the most technical and intense bunch of stuff, and he's arguing against a crazy philosopher. So he's speaking to this crazy guy on all this crazy language, and that's why if you read the Triads right away, St. Gregory of Palamas says that here I'll read what he says. Many people and many monks also pursue secular wisdom, you've heard it said. And if they do not possess this wisdom, it's impossible for them to be ignorant, to avoid ignorance and false opinions. So therefore, we should seek to master, he's saying people say to him, Greek culture and Hellenism. He says these are gifts of God. This education confers on the soul knowledge of created beings, he says. It enriches the faculty of knowledge. It is the greatest of all powers of the soul. Education does not, he's saying these are the things I heard. People told me this, right? So, and we need this philosophic, pagan, Hellenic, natural theology knowledge of God is what he's talking about in order to understand God in the created world. St. Gregory responds by saying, I was in no way convinced when I heard these things that such views being put forward, for in my small experience of monastic life, it showed me that just the opposite was the case. For I was unable to make a defense against them. Quote, we not only occupy ourselves with the mysteries of nature, they would say, but also with the celestial cycles and studying the motions of the stars and natural science, you could say. So he goes on to say that when he thinks about Greek culture, the images of these principles existing, and so forth, he says, when I think about the methods of distinctions and syllogistic reasoning and analysis, that these things relate to the Creator. Now, I myself am incapable of responding to these arguments, and so I maintain silence towards these people. But now I beg you, listen to me, because I will tell you of the apostles' instruction that I should be ready to give an account for the faith that we have. By examining the nature of all these sensible things, I have arrived at a certain conception of God, but not as a conception truly worthy of worship of Him. For according to Paul in Romans 1, by looking at the created world, he says man's heart was darkened. So he actually is saying that Paul, he's pointing out the point that I made when I was looking at Romans 1 a few talks back. And Paul does not say that the natural world is a means where we do Aristotelian syllogisms to get back to God. Paul says that the revelation of the natural world shows that we're idolaters. That's what Gregory Palamos is saying. He says, in fact, has the wisdom of the pagan world achieved what it sought? He says, no. He says the wisdom of the pagan world is demonic. And in fact, it is given the divine name to demons and has worshipped demons. He then goes on to say that Platonism and Plato and his doctrines are demonic. Does that mean that he says nothing true? No. Does that mean that a heretic says nothing true? No. Arius said true things, but his doctrines were demonic. He goes on to say, however, you will say to me that you are denying philosophy. If one says that philosophy, insofar as it is natural, is a gift of God, I agree that what they say is true and without contradiction. And I don't want to be misunderstood, he says, but the mind of demons, right, he says, has perverted these things. And he says that philosophy and Greek wisdom can contain truths. He says, however, the demons have a knowledge of these things and they have perverted it. And therefore, Greek wisdom, for the most part, he says, is demonic. That's St. Gregory Palamos saying that pagan wisdom, it says, if you are going to do this, he says it must be thoroughly purged. And so he goes on and he says that the mysteries of God are a higher version of, it's better to seek a direct perception of God than to be fixated on creatures. And so that's why in apophatic theology we are seeking the direct perception of God via the nous. We don't want to be caught up in obsessing on creatures. It's not that creatures are bad. It's just that we can be deceived by creatures and images from creation. I'm not saying that they're bad. We're not iconoclasts. There's nothing wrong with icons. But he says that the union that we have in theosis is much greater than the knowledge of God that comes through creatures. And that's the key here, is that it's not bad versus good. It's creatures are good, but they are intended to direct us towards a greater union. And that's why he will go on to cite Paul and Paul's translation into the third heavens as the real biblical example par excellence of hesychasm, right? So we're not saying that philosophy is evil. He's not saying philosophy is evil. He's saying that those are created things that are created to lead us to God, but we're not fixated on the creatures. We're supposed to be fixated on God.
Right. And that the created beings give testimony to the existence of the Creator.
But Greek wisdom has the tendency, he says, to be idolatrous. It's polytheistic and it's demonic. I mean, look at what Plato teaches. Plato teaches reincarnation. Plato teaches sacrifice into the gods. Plato teaches man-boy love, all this really perverted stuff. In I think it's Charmides. I've held a whole talk on that. I mean, Platonism is he's right. It's demonic. Now, does it have some true propositions? Sure. But it's the same with Aristotle or any philosopher. David Hume says true things, but that doesn't mean his atheistic system is what we want. I would also recommend, too, if you want a deeper treatment of beyond what we've talked about many times over, the divine essence, divine energies, Athanasopoulos and Schneider. This is Bradshaw's responses to a lot of the critics of the essence energy distinction from different traditions. So you have Thomists, you have Anglicans, all writing responses and critiquing the essence energy distinction. Everybody from Milbank to people I've never heard of. I think one of these was some Dominican. I don't know who he is. And then the responses of Bradshaw. So it's a really good treatise for a more academic, if you want, hardcore response to the critiques from proponents of absolute divine simplicity. So all good stuff there. Anything else you want to add? I mean, we don't have to stop right now, but that's most of what I had, is that I don't think that in conclusion, my conclusion of this would be that I don't think Scotus really is a solution to the essence energy distinction as a way to bridge Latin theology and Western theology. I mean, Scotus is going to teach the filioque. He's going to teach all the same stuff that we would still have a problem with, because it's not just, essence energy is not just an issue of how we reason and speak about God relating to the world. It relates to Christology. Again, when you read Maximus, it's all applied to Christological actions in the world. The essence energy distinction in book 3, chapter 15 is all about Christology. So it's not something that you can just stipulate to being about God's relationship to the world. It spills over into all these other areas, and that's what's crucial to understand. And that's why when you understand that, you can see how it really doesn't matter if Scotus got a few things right, because it still can't be reconciled with orthodoxy. But I'll let you give your assessment of Anselm and orthodoxy, and how do we view this?
Right. Again, same points. We're not saying, and this is what our opponents would always say, but they're saying this here, that what you believe. You believe in apophatism. That's not what's being contended, and argued that, of course, people can say true stuff. And insofar as they do, they're being orthodox. But and this is why it's so important for our modus operandi is Eastern Orthodox, is not a natural theology. It's a presuppositionalism, and therefore we're always looking at, well, what are the presuppositional starting points of these thinkers? And this is what makes it incompatible. Not, of course, they're going to say true stuff, but the starting points we do not grant. That they're neither self-evident, nor should one even start with those sort of starting points. So our critique, at least mine, of Anselm is that the starting point is several. First, his mind. He doesn't even know that he can actually reason properly. He just assumes it. So I'd call him out on that you can't just assume something. That's putting, you're just getting ahead of yourself, epistemically. Second of all, he assumes a Neoplatonic idea of being, and like the natural theologian, that this notion of being, and as we saw in Duns Scotus as well, should just be self-evident to, and therefore this is incompatible with orthodoxy. And my final critique is that it's inconsistent. His argument is inconsistent when he all of a sudden says that, God is, greater than can be thought and can no way exist in the mind. And then immediately in chapter 5 goes from where he originally said that id quod meus cogitare nequit, that in which nothing greater can be thought, then all of a sudden exchanges meus with melius, better. But God is that in which nothing better can be thought. So I'd question that move, that, wait a minute, where do you... Because this is where he's going to move exactly into these cataphatic things that, okay, no, God's supreme bonum, he's this and that from that move. So I think that's highly contentious. I don't think he can do something like that. And again, he doesn't have an essence energy's distinction. He's committed to an absolute divine simplicity model. And for all these reasons, stated that Anselm's argument, his theology, is incompatible. We could make a similar argument if we started from kind of a presuppositional point of revelation to us, whereby we first and foremost ground and justify human reasoning, morality, what is actually better, so that it's not just a relative term, through a sort of transcendental argument, very much like the fathers do. And I'd like to say for all the critics out there that the fathers don't use transcendental arguments. This is the word concept fallacy that people get so hung up on. It doesn't matter if they don't use the word transcendental, and this comes from Calvinist goofuses like Van Til and Bahnsen. The concept is there and it's being used. Call it whatever you want. The concept is what we're referring to with.
Well, how much irony is that from, they'll say, you can't use an argument from Van Til and Bahnsen as they turn around and use everything from Aristotle, right? So, I mean, they'll do the very thing that they're calling us out for, genetic fallacy, as if the argument isn't sound regardless of who it comes from. It doesn't matter whether it comes from Van Til or Bahnsen or whoever. I mean, if the argument is sound, it's sound, right? So we don't have a problem with something true in Aristotle, something true in Bahnsen, something true in Van Til, something true in Plato, something true in Plotinus. We're fine because we have that flexibility because we're not married to the the strict sort of substance accidents causal chain scheme of Aristotle. We have no problem moving in and out of these systems, and you see that with St. John of Damascus, right? He's not married to the substance accidents dualism of Aristotle because he can say on the one hand that God is in one sense pure act, and then in the other sense he can say that God has uncreated energies that are actually distinct from his essence. And he has no problem with that because he doesn't conceive of the uncreated energies to be accidents, right? So there's flexibility there. And again, read Dr. Bradshaw on Aristotle, East and West, and you'll see how there's a different usage of Aristotle between East and West, and that's what's key to see. And the Latins don't understand that. They think that there's really just one way. You have to sort of squish the whole system into one way of doing it. So to sum up, we have the differences here. When we look at Scotus, when we look at Anselm, we have a different order of theology, so it doesn't work. Both of them still presuppose natural theology. So whether it's Aristotle or the Neoplatonic assumptions of either one, I think my thing is coming out reverse because I'm doing screen capture, but you can reverse this and you can figure it out if you're seeing it in reverse. But 4 is you still have the other absolute divine simplicity assumptions. So the ideas are still present there, such as filioque, created grace, beatific vision. And therefore, ultimately, no, it's not possible to utilize John Duns Scotus or Anselm as bridge ecumenist figures. So this refutes the Uniates, this refutes the Eastern Catholics, this refutes Ibarra and Lofton, and the guys who are trying to say that, well, it's all the same stuff, man, Dr. Jared Goff, etc. So that's my take on it, and I'm going to put Father Norwegian News is his channel. I forgot to link it. I'll link it when the stream's done. I'll put it in there for the rest of the people who come and see it tomorrow. They'll have the links to his stream. I'm afraid if let me put it in there. I'll let you close up and I'll put your links in the chat while we're talking about it, and then I'll add it to the show description. But I don't think we're going to do a part 2. I think we covered most of the ground that we wanted to cover in this first half, so I'll take off the fact that this won't be a half talk. But everybody subscribe to Norwegian News, his channel. It's pulling up Norwegian nouns. That's not what I want. Norwegian News. I'll put his channel here in the chat. Almost blocked you.
Other channel. Don't look at it.
Yeah, you're not doing a grammar channel. Norwegian nouns. That actually came up. So everybody subscribe to Father Deacon Dr. Ananias. There is his channel. I will split these super chats, of course, with him. So I forgot the super chats. Can't forget that. Thank you guys. So I'm going to read those super chats.
Let me just say real quickly.
Yeah, sure.
Both Jay and I critique Bahnsen and Van Til's transcendental argument. I think they're correct about some things, but in the end, because of their notion of who God is and that they don't have a notion of the essence energies distinction, that this is not going to satisfy for the justification for the possibility of knowledge, morality. And so I will end with that, and then we'll do the super chat.
Yeah, actually, I tweeted an article that a guy I know a long time ago, he wrote. Actually, he doesn't cite me in this essay, but he's actually citing me. But you can find it on my Twitter. It's from Orthodox Bridge or something like that. But it's about Van Til and the Trinity, and he's critiquing Van Til's absolute divine simplicity, because Van Til has this mistake where he says that the essence of God is a person, and he was trying to get around the problem of impersonalism, which Orthodoxy does avoid. So Van Til saw the problem, but he was still within the Western framework of absolute divine simplicity and Augustinianism. So that's why Van Tilianism doesn't actually work to solve the problem. So it's just nonsense when traditional Catholics say, "Oh, you're a Van Tilian, you're a Calvinist." No, no, no. All Calvinists believe in the filioque and absolute divine simplicity. So we're not Calvinists. There's no Calvinists who teach the essence energy distinction. All right, so Franklin Chan, I know that there's some Calvinists that'll say, yes, there is. There'll be some dude. But typically speaking, classical Reformation theology totally affirms absolute divine simplicity, totally affirms the classical Latin filioque, which we do not. Franklin Chan, $10. Thank you for the work. Like always, Jay. Thank you, Franklin Chan. Much appreciated. He's always big time supporter. We got 2 big fat super chats here, so I want to thank those guys. Acrobatic Jesus 199, love you, Merry Christmas. We love you, Merry Christmas to you.
Christmas.
And Acrobatic Jesus sends $50, big Christmas present.
Yeah.
So we'll be splitting that between me and Father Deacon Dr. Ananias. Adam Ray sends $50. He says, "Thank you for turning me on to Orthodoxy. I was chrismated Sunday after Pentecost."
Glory to God.
Welcome. I mean, I was raised Baptist, but it was Christ and the Orthodox Church that saved my faith. I don't know where I would be without it. I feel the same way. I don't know where I would have been if I had just wandered off in the worlds of Calvinism and Roman Catholicism. So I feel you on that, Adam Ray, and welcome to Orthodoxy. Christos Anesti, $4. Thank you all for your work. God bless. Thank you.
Thank you.
Randy Churchill, Jay, Anselm assumed that God's justice looks like human justice. Yes. Is this idea from God being bound by necessity? Did Anselm not believe in the freedom of God? This is an interesting question because this gets into what's called theological voluntarism. To be fair to Anselm, I don't. Maybe you could argue that his idea of God having to satisfy his own standard of justice, which is a goofy, weird thing about absolute divine simplicity. I would argue that yes, I think maybe you're right that. So in Calvinism, theological voluntarism identifies the will of God with the essence of God. So basically whatever happens is the determined will of God because God's essence is his will. God's essence is necessary, therefore his will is necessary, therefore what he wills is necessary, and thus you get the predeterminism. So in Calvinism, this is referred to. Calvinistic theology is theological voluntarism, right? So it identifies God's will with his essence, and this is one of the problems of how there really is actually free will. Well, there's not, ultimately, if you're consistent. Thus, I would say you're correct that Anselm's theory of atonement probably is bound up with identifying God's justice with his essence and with his will, and so therefore he has to be paid. There's no other way around it, and who could pay off God other than God? So that's probably true. Bound by necessity, yes, I would say that this is ultimately what you get when you don't believe that the persons in God are distinct from the nature. If if the persons are identified with nature, which Thomism does, absolute divine simplicity does, then you would get a confusion, and you would get actions of God that are determined, and so God's justice would not be an energy; it would be his essence, and so therefore, as with all the Latin theologians, Anselm's belief in God's freedom is compromised. I mean, he can profess to believe in the freedom of God, but if absolute divine simplicity is true, then he doesn't really.
All these are going to apply to the Islamic notion of God too. I've even heard them say that they think that they have a concept of divine energies too. They don't.
Some of them do. They say, but they don't actually.
It's attributes within God's essence. They have nothing.
Right. It's not at all the uncreated energies. And to prove that, every time you ask them about creation, they'll tell you that God being a creator is synonymous. He's an eternal creator. I mean, they're all over the board too. By the way, there's not one Islamic philosophy and theology. We've had about 5 different Islamic debates in the Discord, and I've heard 5 different things. So, I think ultimately, yes, the critiques of absolute divine simplicity do still apply to Islamic thought. Thomas W. sends $5. Thank you, Thomas W. All right, I don't see any more super chats, so I did put your channel into the chat, and I'll put it into the show description. Anything else you want to add, Father Deacon Dr.
Let's see. Well, it's going to be really important to understand a fundamental distinction between the East and the West, oral theology, is natural theology, so just in conclusion, natural theology in the West assumes a pretended autonomy with regard to epistemology with man, that they could reason, and therefore things are self-evident. It's a whole bunch of assumptions that cannot be established, and therefore then reason up to God, but then you get to a generic notion of God. You don't get to God as person. And orthodoxy, in contrast, holds a presuppositional theology in which we receive the fullness of revelation. God is Lord and has revealed himself to us. God is the Lord and and he's revealed himself to us. And therefore, we develop something like a transcendental argument, and can ground our knowledge. So we can use these arguments, and the only ones that can use this, because our opponents, natural theologians, they grant that they can reason before they can establish they can actually reason correctly.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's that Feser quote, Dr. Feser, the famous Thomist. So I put the quote up many times, where he says that we affirm as Roman Catholics the classical theist tradition, which is the same theology of Plotinus, the same theology of Avicenna, the same theology of Maimonides, the same theology of Aquinas. Everybody's teaching the same generic God, he says in that famous quote. And that same generic God, he says, is an absolutely simple superessence. We do not affirm that. That is from the beginning point of their theology. That's the beginning point where we diverge, right, from ours. I would add to the divine divine satisfaction theory, which is really pioneered here in Anselm. This is what leads to the Reformation penal substitution theory. So we have to remember this, that Anselm is not just leading people in a direction of mistaken areas. I mean, he's got some good points, but he's also got some serious problems. And one of those is the divine satisfaction theory, because even though Anselm doesn't necessarily, he does have some Nestorianish statements, but even though he doesn't conceive of it as one hypostasis damning the other, the reformers are a little more consistent, because they say, well, if the divine satisfaction has to be appeased and it's damnation, then you can see the train of thought of Luther and some of the classical reformers who said that, well, then there has to be a giving out of damnation, because that's the punishment. So if that's the case, if there's a penal substitution, then in their view, then the Son has to be damned. And so that leads the reformers to either the Nestorian conclusion of a human hypostasis Jesus, the dude who gets damned, and many reformers teach this, or the idea of a splitting of the Trinity, where the second person of the Godhead is damned by the Father, which is obviously blasphemous and anti-Trinitarian. So you only have two options if you continue with the divine satisfaction theory, if you try to be more consistent than Anselm was. And we see that as leading to ultimately total heresy and blasphemy and nonsense. And that's why we do have there is an aspect of penal substitution for us. This is discussed in Book 3 of St. John Damascus, the Exposition of Orthodox Faith, the last 3 or 4 chapters of Book 3. He discusses how the humanity of Christ does undergo death. The divine hypostasis of the Son, however, does not suffer alteration or change, because he's impassible. But there is a punishment, you can say, that is meted out upon the humanity of Christ. But that's the only aspect of Christ, or the only nature of Christ, is human nature, which actually even could undergo death. So there is a penal substitution aspect to our view. St. Athanasius mentions it On the Incarnation. In Book 3, the last few chapters talks about how it's only Christ's human nature that undergoes death and the punishment, and he does use the word punishment. And thus it is only the human soul of Christ that's deified that descends into Hades. St. John Damascus is very clear, because we want to avoid Nestorianism even in the death of Christ. And so his divine hypostasis, St. John says, was never parted from his human body, even in
That's
the
great point that Jay clearly stated so eloquently, that the reason why, the cause of why, many of you might even know this, why so many Protestants are Nestorian. Their Jesus is a Nestorian when it comes to the this is really pronounced in the crucifixion and his death. That and they don't even know it, that's the historian, but they speak about it all the time. And so it was wonderful that you actually gave the cause of that. You traced that back historically to where that came from. Mike, your mic.
Yeah, it is. It's Anselm's satisfaction theory. That's the even though he's not saying all the conclusions of the reformers, he's sort of the origin of it. And I think actually Clark Carlton has a good chapter on critiquing Anselm on this point, that he kind of sets the stage for it. Many theologians in the Reformation tradition have called attention to this, that Anselm's satisfaction theory is the basis for what would become the reformers' penal substitution theory. But you're absolutely right as an historian.
Shut this phone off. Can you hear it?
Are you calling me from the circus?
Yes. Like... Yes, Lord.
You're calling me from the...
Lord, thank you for condemning the Nestorians. Please, your holy name. It wasn't the Lord. Yeah, well put, Jay. And thank you. Yeah, I'm glad that people were able to see that traced out historically to where. That's why it's so important that what Christ questioned, who do you say that I am? Peter confesses it, and then he says, blessed are you, Peter, for flesh and blood did not reveal this.
Yes.
Or cosmological arguments.
Well, no, he said, blessed are you, Peter. Here is a giant palace in Avignon, France, for your descendants. That's exactly, yeah. That's literally what the text says in the Greek. All right. So
here's an empty chair in a trailer park.
Which, if you're not united to, you're damned, by the way.
Yeah, that's right.
So, all right, we're done. I think great show. Everybody subscribe to Father Deacon Dr. Ananias in his channel, Norwegian News. And what do you have coming up? You got any chats and lectures coming up that we can expect?
Yeah, I have some. I still have the AMA that a lot of people wanted to ask me questions. Somebody also brought up, I thought this was a really great idea, especially because my work, I've done some work in this area, but an orthodox response to mental illness, I think, would be an excellent. It seems to me that a lot of people like kind of the practical questions.
Yeah.
Of course, I've got some upcoming streams with a wonderful apologist. He's a Coptic named Tilo. And we're going to talk about actually our conversion stories from Protestantism, and answering the Protestant objections is some of the.
Oh, that reminds me. Yes, actually, I reached out and finally got a hold of Jerry Matitix. Jerry Matitix is a pretty prominent. He was more active a few years ago, but he's a pretty well-known sedevacantist apologist. Jerry and I have always been on pretty good friendly terms. We've had a lot of interactions in the past. So Jerry and I are going to do a couple interviews where we have agreement points. We're going to agree and discuss and critique Vatican II and the theology that led to Vatican II. And then as we kind of establish some rapport, Jerry and I will be doing a debate on sedevacantism versus orthodoxy. So I forgot to mention that. I talked to Jerry last night for like an hour, so I got to catch up with him. So look for that. That's going to be, I think, very fruitful, because Jerry is a very honorable guy, very cool guy to talk to, super, super smart. He's actually been on Jeopardy. You can see him with Alex Trebek. So Jerry will be he will probably be the best sedevacantist. A lot of these sedevacantist guys are just like, you can't even interact with them. They act like lunatics. So Thomas W., as for your question, I will not be interacting with those people in person. I do have a response video where I critique sedevacantism on my channel that I did last week, so you can go watch the.
It was excellent. It was excellent.
Thank you. So you can go watch that sedevacantist critique based on John Pontrello's book, our friend who we helped move into orthodoxy out of sedevacantism. So definitely get John's book, Sedevacantist Delusion. It's great. And so I forgot, yes, so tomorrow we have a discussion with Bob the Builder. This was organized by Lewis. Thank you to Lewis for that. Bob is who helped set up the debate with Paul Williams, the Muslim guy that I debated about 6 months ago. And then Bob is I'm not exactly sure. I know he likes aspects of Orthodoxy, so we'll be talking about, I think he's kind of evangelical-ish, not trying to offend Bob, but we'll be talking about things that he sees in Orthodoxy, things he sees in Islam that are problematic, problems in Orthodoxy. We'll be having a discussion on that tomorrow. And then, of course, yes, tomorrow night I will be debating the Kurgan. So that will be at Ralph's tomorrow night. Everybody can go find that. I'm sure everybody knows where that is. So that will be going down as far as I know. I don't expect that to be much of a debate, but please just pray that I will keep my composure. I need to not lose composure. I don't even want to deal with that crowd of people. The only set of a contest that I look forward to dealing with is Jerry, because Jerry is a gentleman and a very, very smart, honest guy. Jerry's an honest guy. So he will, I think Jerry said to me, he said, if Orthodoxy is true, I want to be Orthodox. So I appreciate Jerry saying that. So pray for Jerry Madzik. Maybe we can make Jerry Orthodox. So we'll be having some discussions with Jerry in January, and then the first week of January, I think I have a debate with Ijaz. I don't know who Ijaz is. I know he focuses on textual criticism. But actually, Ijaz wanted to do a debate with me on Orthodox philosophy. So it'll be interesting to see where we take the absolute divine simplicity critiques with Ijaz. I don't know Ijaz, so we'll see where that goes. That's what I've got coming up. So look for the debate tomorrow and the discussion with Bob. And Nathaniel Hill, he sends $42. Wow, thank you, Nathaniel. Much appreciated. Another fat super chat. But that's what's coming up. And so I'll see you guys tomorrow with Bob the Builder and the debate with the Kurgan.
By the way, Jay, you know what we should do? We should do a video together where we talk about the formation of the canon, canonicity.
Yes, I've been wanting to do that for a long time. And now that I have, I tweeted out the Lee McDonald appendix that I meant to, now that I got my library back, I've got all my canonics books ready to go. His appendix of all the different canons through the different centuries, which is a good place to start. We will do that. Yes, we will do that maybe next week, if you can.
Wonderful. Okay, blessings. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jay, for having me. Excellent arguments. I really appreciated your clarity of thought and clarity of arguments with regards to Scotus. And I hope everybody else did as well.
All right, everybody have a good night. And you want to give us a blessing, Father? Can you do a blessing on a general audience online? Is that appropriate?
In the prayers of our Holy Father, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy upon us and save us. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, now and ever, into ages of ages. Amen. Blessed Nativity. And for new calendar, I believe it's St. Herman of Alaska today. And yes, I pray that... give your hearts, give your, Christmas is about giving, and that doesn't just mean, physical presence, but all the Gospels leading up were about this through the Sundays. And so, give your life out to your service and your kindness, and, restrain your passions. And my prayers for all of you. God bless you.